Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's event, Tibetan Democracy in Exile, Religious Freedom and Political Empowerment. It's an honor to host Penpa Tsering, the president, or Sikyong, of the Central Tibetan Administration today. My name is James Mazzarella, and I'm the Senior Director of the Freedom and Prosperity Center here at the Atlantic Council. Today's conversation comes at a critically important moment. Just yesterday, well, in addition to the Dalai Lama winning a Grammy, just yesterday, the Tibetan refugees around the world cast their ballots in the preliminary elections for president and parliament for their exiled government. This is, I believe, the 18th election that they've had. Remarkable. While the final election will not take place until later this spring, yesterday's vote highlights a very distinctive democratic process. An entire electorate across 27 countries on the same day voting for representatives tied to the provinces from which they were forced to flee and which many have never even been to. Over decades, His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama has deliberately transferred power to elected institutions and embedded democratic governance and religious and other freedoms into the foundations of the exiled administration. The result is a system that guarantees pluralism, protects religious freedom, and holds leaders accountable, all despite the absence of a territory. Today's conversation matters deeply to the work of the Freedom and Prosperity Center, which strives to promote evidence-based policymaking for the well-being of people around the world. The Freedom and Prosperity Indexes, which we publish, show that countries which are committed to political freedom, upholding free and fair elections, protecting political rights, fostering freedom of speech and association, all experience markedly stronger economic development and human development outcomes. In fact, over a 20-year period, countries that improve political freedom see an 8.8% boost in GDP per capita versus those who do not. Religious freedom is an important part of this story. Where religious freedom is protected, we see stronger human development outcomes, greater social trust, and more resilient institutions. Yet the global trend is moving in the opposite direction. Political freedom worldwide has steadily declined for the past 12 years. Religious freedom has been in a sustained global decline since 2010, with repression of religious institutions steadily worsening. These trends shape economic behavior, civic life, long-term prosperity, or the lack of it. That is why the Tibetan in exile case is so instructive. Democratic life took root. Religious life flourished. Those freedoms became catalysts for gains in education, health, community resilience, and sustainable livelihoods. It offers a powerful counterpoint to authoritarian governance. It is therefore my privilege to introduce our event today. The Sikyong has been the democratically elected political leader of the Tibetan government in exile since 2021. Before this, he served in the exiled parliament, where he advanced the middle way approach advocated by the Dalai Lama for resolving Tibet's conflict with China, and that's something I'm sure you're going to hear about more today. The conversation today is being facilitated by Adva Saldinger. Adva is a senior reporter at DevEx, where she covers U.S. foreign policy and development issues. She explores the role that the private sector and private capital can play in development, and she authors the weekly DevEx Invested newsletter, which I'm sure everybody here is either subscribed to or will at the end of this time. It focuses on the role of business and financing in addressing challenges. For those joining online, you can submit questions via askac.org, and we ask that you do so as soon as possible. We'll also open the floor to in-person questions, of course, later in the program. So now, please join me in welcoming the Sikyong and our moderator, Adva.
Thank you, James. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Sikyong, it is a pleasure to have this opportunity to speak with you today. Thank you for being here with me, with all of us.
Thank you.
I want to start by asking you a little bit about what brings you to DC on this trip and the International Religious Freedom Summit. and why you feel it important to be here and to be discussing with the US government, with others, the importance of religious freedom.
One of the reasons, of course, is to attend the International Religious Freedom Conference, which we did this morning. We got a spotlight with Speaker Pelosi on the freedom of religious belief for the Tibetans inside Tibet, and also to do with reincarnation of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And then, of course, there was this book launch by Professor Lau. His Holiness is trying to seek a negotiated, peaceful, mutually beneficial solution for the Sino-Tibet conflict, which could be lasting. So the U.S. government has played quite a role since 2002 to pass the Tibet Policy Act, and then there is the Tibet Support and Policy Act signed by President Trump into law. And then in 2024, we had the Resolve Tibet Act, because we changed our strategy a little bit. We were focused on the middle way, but then we started seeking acknowledgement for the historical status of Tibet as an independent state and the current situation of Tibet under the repressive Chinese government, a path called the middle path based on the Buddhist thinking. So when we say middle, there are ends to it. And if there is no recognition for the ends, then there is no value for middle way. So based on that, we have been working with the US government over the last, from 22 to 24, and got this Resolve Tibet Act passed. And Professor Lau's book, which is based on imperial Chinese historical records. And he's a Chinese scholar and proves that Tibet has never been considered a part of China by imperial Chinese records. If you can consider the Yuans, the Mongols, and the Manchus as Chinese dynasties. They have never considered Tibet as part of it. And there was also a legal perspective research done by Michael Van Wall Prague, which looks at Tibetan history from an international legal perspective and proves that Tibet has never been part of China. So these are some of the things we have been taking around the world, and also the issue of His Holiness reincarnation, where China is more concerned about the yet to come 15th Dalai Lama than the living 14th Dalai Lama. So we have to put our narrative on the world stage, I think, which we did quite well on His Holiness 90th birthday last July, where we had some 218 media people from around the world in Dharamsala for about a week, and His Holiness made his statement, his position on what Chinese have been saying, because China has three positions. One is that they will look for the 15th Dalai Lama within China, which means the communist government is ordering the Dalai Lama not to be reborn outside Tibet or China. And then the second position is the use of golden urn, which they say is a tradition. And my argument is there have been 8 Dalai Lamas before the golden urn, or the so-called golden urn, supposed to have been introduced in 1793, but there's no evidence of that. So we are also planning to hold a conference on Tibetan history among a series of it, and also focus on this area of the golden urn, where China is misused for the 11th Panchen Lama, for the selection of the 11th Panchen Lama, which they will do again for the next Dalai Lama also. So these are some of the things, that narratives that we need to push into the international. The Resolve Tibet Act also talks about the historical status of Tibet, because China keeps saying Tibet has been part of China since antiquity. And the book by Professor Lau is also a personal revelation for him, because when he was going to a Chinese school, they were always taught that Tibet is part of China since antiquity. And when he reached university, he found that the communist government is asking every other government to say Tibet is part of PRC. So he wondered, what is the truth? So he went looking for that truth, and he found this, and he came out with a 1,300-page book, which are irrefutable evidence of Tibet not having been part of China.
So I guess one of my questions, I want to talk a little bit more about the middle way and the middle path, because whether or not China will accept the arguments put forward in this book, I think, is an open question. And I think, really to understand, the middle way is not a new policy. It's a policy that His Holiness the Dalai Lama put forward many years ago. It's a policy that the government in exile has been pursuing. But I think the fundamental question to me is, has there been any progress? It doesn't seem like the Chinese government is responding or acknowledging that this could be an option. And so I guess the question is, how does the position then evolve? Do you need to say, okay, maybe this isn't working the way we wanted? I know there was a congressional hearing here in the US, I think in November, where some representatives, including Representative Jim McGovern, sort of said, do we need to rethink the middle way? Do you need to set timelines or boundaries, et cetera? So I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit about sort of what the middle way policy is and how you're thinking about its evolution, or whether it continues to be sort of a useful policy.
From the time we came into exile in 1959 till about 1973, we asked for independence because Tibet was an independent nation and we were seeking independence for Tibet. His Holiness was doing the same. Then around 1973-74, that was at the height of cultural revolution that was going on inside China, where everything was being destroyed. Some 6,000 Tibetan monasteries were destroyed. 1.2 million Tibetans died as a direct or indirect result of China's occupation. Then His Holiness thought about the survival, the existential problem of the Tibetans. So it is more important to preserve the Tibetan identity in form of language and culture and religion than seeking independence, because at that time no countries were supporting Tibet. So since 1973, His Holiness started thinking about the middle way. Then there was Deng Xiaoping. Mao Zedong died and Deng Xiaoping took power, and he was a little more liberal. And he met with His Holiness' elder brother, Gyaltsen Thunrup, who died last year, and said, other than independence, we can discuss about everything. So we sent fact-finding delegations into Tibet in the early 80s. There were 2 exploratory teams to send in 82 and 84, whether some kind of negotiation is possible. There were leadership like Hu Yaobang, who were a little more liberal during those days. And then people started asking, what does His Holiness mean by middle way? So for the first time, His Holiness spoke about the 5-point peace proposal, starting by announcing Tibet as a natural reserve, or denuclearization, demilitarization, all that. The 5th point was on negotiation. So that was presented at the Human Rights Caucus of the US Congress those days. And this morning, Tom Lantos' daughter was there at the IRF, led by Tom Lantos and others in the US Congress. His Holiness presented that. And the subsequent year, in 1988, His Holiness expanded on the 5th point on negotiations. Then it remained like that for several years. We went through our process of deciding what should be the future course of for Tibetan people. We went through a sort of referendum. We didn't have to go through that. We went through a public opinion. Majority of the Tibetans said that based on the changes in international politics, China and Tibet, whatever His Holiness decides, we will follow that. And the Parliament also unanimously adopted that in 1997, and His Holiness reiterated his position on middle way. So we find nothing wrong with middle way. But if you look at the conflicts around the world, you wonder whether you are really resolving one problem or creating more problems for future. So what His Holiness is seeking is, of course, a compromise, but not asking for independence. But sometimes you wonder who really wants Tibet to be separated from China. Because His Holiness chants like a mantra, middle way, middle way, middle way, and the Chinese government keeps calling us separatist, separatist, separatist. So who really wants Tibet to be separated from China? It's the Chinese government, not His Holiness, who's asking for autonomy, willing to live within the framework of the Chinese constitution. So that went on for 2002. There was some kind of approach from the Chinese government, and from 2002 to 2010, there were some rounds of dialogue, but essentially meant for China's coming out party, the Olympics. Once the Olympics was done, then it stopped, in 2010. So around 2008, Chinese government asked, what do you mean by middle way? So we presented a paper to the Chinese government, a paper called Memorandum of Genuine Autonomy for the Tibetan People. Now, after the presentation of that paper, the Chinese government reached out to some 15 embassies and started putting their version of what had happened. And then we had to come out with an explanatory note to that. So those are all in writing. It went up to 2010. And since then, there have been no reach out from the Chinese side. I have mentioned about back channels since January 2023. We still send some people, but nothing of consequence. The whole idea is to explore whether there could be a renewal of contact and then maybe eventual negotiation. But if you look at the present Chinese leadership and their policies in the whole of China and particularly in Tibet, the whole idea is if there are no nationalities, then there won't be nationality issues. So how do you make sure that there are no nationalities? You cannot kill all the Tibetans. That would amount to genocide. So what they are doing is they are assimilating Tibetans into the Chinese culture. They want a uniform Chinese community, just like America is a big melting pot. But it's happening naturally here, where in China it's being forced by the state to assimilate and targeting our language, targeting our religion, our way of life, and of course environment. So everything is aimed at destruction of Tibetan identity. So that is where we are. And we are persistent with the middle way because we are trying to find a way through nonviolence, through negotiation. That could be mutually beneficial because Chinese are bereft of spiritualism for so many decades. And we are talking about more than 250 million Chinese Buddhists who look up to Tibet for spiritual inspiration. And His Holiness believes that we can fill that void for the Chinese people. And Tibetans can benefit economically. That's where His Holiness is talking about the mutual beneficial solution. And that could be lasting. And this will also have a lot of implications for the geopolitical, geostrategic implications in the region. If the Sino-Tibet conflict is resolved, then India-China border issue also could be resolved because it's India-Tibet border. Even today, Indians call it Indo-Tibetan Border Police, Indo-Tibetan Border Force, not Indo-China border. That underlies Indian government's thinking because Tibet has always been the buffer between China and India over centuries, because to understand Tibetan history, you have to understand Tibetan geography also. Because Tibet is called as the roof of the world. We call ourselves the land surrounded by snow mountain ranges. It's the highest plateau and the biggest plateau on earth. And Chinese environmental scientists today call Tibet the third pole because Tibet has the largest amount of glaciers and permafrost that feeds all these major rivers in Asia. And then Tibet is also called as the water tower of Asia. So it has a lot of environmental, geostrategic, cultural implications, not only for the Tibetans, but for the whole world. So His Holiness believes in the idea of common prosperity, common benefit. He appreciates the concept of European Union. And then why not Tibet with China? Whether we like it or not, we cannot lift Tibet out of that place and put it somewhere in the Atlantic or the Pacific. So whenever we get to return back, we have to live in harmony with our neighbors, whether it's Chinese or Indians. And that's what we are trying to do, not asking for too much.
Yeah. Can I ask you a question? You talked about about this sort of central role in geopolitics and in the region. Do you see any changes or openings now, given where things are? How do you think, for example, U.S.-China policy or broader policy in the Indo-Pacific impacts the opportunities or future for the Tibetan people or to any resolution?
We are also trying to get into the Indo-Pacific narrative because all these reverse intros South China flow from Tibet. Definitely, all the global political dynamism is so fluid right now that it's very difficult to make assumptions about future. But then we watch all the developments, what China is doing in all the multilateral forums, what's happening with trade. We just don't talk about politics, but trade, commerce, security, whole lot of things. So we are watching how things are shaping up because of US tariffs. India seemingly going towards China. But I think you will have to watch this over a longer period because one thing that you need to build better relations is trust. And that does not exist. Right now, it's more pragmatism based on the reality of things that you need to be dependent on China, so why not do it when you have other challenges to take on? So we are watching every situation, but we do have very close relationship with the government of India. I've always said we have very transparent relationship. If it is not for the government of India, we don't exist as a government in exile. So it's because of the government of India that we exist in India. We also receive humanitarian support from the government of India. We do understand where government of India is in relation with China, and even all the neighboring countries of China, like Japan, Australia, Taiwan, everywhere. We are watching the whole situation. So one of the things that we need to do is to look at different scenarios for China in future. So under each scenario, what could be the opportunities and what could be challenges for Tibet and Tibetans?
I think one question I have is sort of how you view the Trump administration's policies around international religious freedom, which they've talked about quite a lot, and its policies towards China and the region as impacting the Tibetan people, the government in exile. And also wanted to ask a little bit about, we saw a really big disruption in U.S. foreign assistance at the beginning of this year. And my understanding is that the Tibetan people, the government in exile, received money from the U.S. government. So I'm curious, if that was disrupted, is it back on track? Are you receiving funding, and sort of how this administration's policies are impacting?
We are a little more fortunate, I think, because of His Holiness, again. Because of His Holiness, we have many friends in the Congress, on both sides of the aisle, in both houses. So we have very good congressional support that we can count on. And then within the administration also, Secretary Rubio, when he was a senator, he had championed many of these bills on Tibet that has turned into acts which he should be implementing now. So and we do have very good relations with the State Department. So there was no formal announcement, but we believe that the Special Coordinator for Tibetan Issues have been appointed. On the funding side, the cut was universal. So it's not only for Tibetans, but our offices here, the International Campaign for Tibet, the Office of Tibet, and all our friends in the Congress, we all work together in the State Department. Everybody worked together to get back at least half of the funding. From 12 million, we are getting back 6.8 million, which not many others have managed to do. And we are also happy to say that we have the provision for budget in the 2026 budget, which will be passed today, hopefully in the House, and then signed by President Trump into a law. And there is a new wording in the appendix that says that for the purpose of the act, the Central Tibetan Administration would be considered the Tibetan government in exile. So this is also one step forward. So we are trying to reach to all the political parties, and every political party has been supportive. And all the institutions are also supportive. We are also reaching out as much as possible. So we are a bit safe. But then again, on religious freedom, it's a core value of the American democratic system. And Ambassador Brownback has been quite generous in inviting us for the IRF along with the organizers. And I mentioned about the Article 18 Alliance of Religious Belief, which was hosted by Czech Republic last November. We got support. So we are trying to reach out. One of the advocacy work that, because China is very concerned about the 15th Dalai Lama, so we have to do our own thing. So the first community that gets impacted is the Tibetan community. So we got all the Tibetan community together to write to His Holiness about his reincarnation. That's why His Holiness made this statement on July 2nd last year about his reincarnation. We reached out to the larger Tibetan Buddhist community in the Himalayas, in the Mongol area, Russian republics of Tuva, Kalmykia, Buryat, and new adherents of His Holiness. We also reached out to last September. There was, for the first time, there were representatives from 12 different countries of Southeast Asia and East Asia, from South Korea to Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, Singapore, these 5 Southeast Asian countries, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh, they all came up to Dharamsala, offered His Holiness a long life prayer for his 90th birthday, and conferred on His Holiness the title Supreme Patriarch of the Buddhist world. So, as the government, United States already has this law in the form of Tibet Support and Policy Act, wherein they have this element of His Holiness reincarnation, which also talks about sanctioning Chinese officials who would be responsible for choosing the next Dalai Lama. And we reached out to other governments in Europe, so UK, Germany, France, Holland, Iceland, Estonia, and Lithuania. They jointly issued a statement on the religious freedom of Tibetan people and the right to choose their incarnation according to Tibetan tradition.
I did want to ask you a little bit more about questions of succession, because I think, His Holiness the Dalai Lama is 90 years old, and I think it's something a lot of people are thinking about for the future of the Tibetan people. Obviously, he's done a lot to devolve his political power to the administration, but he still is really plays a very important role in the community. And so, you've talked about sort of the Chinese government's desire. They've said they'll maybe select the next Dalai Lama. So what happens in a world where maybe there are 2 that are put forward as a successor? What are some of the challenges you see, and how do you think that will impact sort of religious freedom and regional stability?
I keep telling the Chinese, do you want a lifelong headache or not? If you want a lifelong headache, then you should choose 2 Dalai Lamas. Because by that time, when these problems are there, Xi Jinping won't be alive in this world. So he creates the problem and leaves the world. So that doesn't make sense. So if the Chinese are smart enough, they should respect the Tibetan people's religious belief. Because that's what the Chinese constitution also talks about. But of course, they use His Holiness reincarnation as a political tool. Of course, His Holiness keeps saying, I'll live for another 2 decades and more. And I keep telling the Chinese, this message is for you, because you're waiting for this Dalai Lama to die, and His Holiness keeps saying, I'll live for another 2 decades and more. There will be challenges, of course. And we will have our own Dalai Lama in exile. But if you look at Chinese Panchen Lama, who is now they send him more and more into Tibet, and also give him more leverage and space to organize religious teachings and all that, because they will use him eventually to choose the next Dalai Lama. But within the Tibetan community inside Tibet, he is not respected. If you ask about the Chinese, they say, oh, a fake Panchen Lama, or they would say he's just another leader. So just to show their displeasure, they don't sell the pictures of Chinese Panchen Lama, which they can do if they want. And they can't sell the picture of His Holiness Panchen Lama is nowhere to be seen. The only picture was when he was 6 years old. So to show their displeasure, they sell pictures of only the 10th Panchen Lama. So those things are there. So these Chinese Panchen Lama, he has never been able to travel outside, except for a short, brief visit to Thailand and Hong Kong. There was talks about him coming to Nepal, which he never could. So where's the influence? So the Dalai Lama that will be born in the free world can travel any part of the world, spread the message of peace and compassion. So the leverage is different. The one will be under the control of the Chinese government, will not be given access to travel outside, or they might fear that he might, leave the country. So there will be a lot of things, but what we are most fearful is that if there is no peaceful resolution to the Sino-Tibet conflict before this Dalai Lama leaves this world, one can imagine the emotional implications for Tibetans inside Tibet. And so far, Tibetans are restrained by His Holiness. His Holiness keeps saying that if you take up violence, I will no more be responsible for the cause. So it's not like Tibetans cannot take up violence. Tibetans were warriors. We were a big power in Central Asia between 7th to 9th century when we conquered the capital of China and put a puppet emperor there and went up to Samarkand. present-day Uzbekistan. That used to be the extent of Tibetan Empire at one time. It's only because of Tibetan warriors. It's not like Tibetans cannot kill, but they burned themselves. So we were talking about 157 self-immolations, most of them between the age of 17 to 35. They've never witnessed independent Tibet. They've never witnessed cultural revolution. They see only what the Chinese government is doing to Tibet and Tibetans today, and are driven to this act of self-immolation, hoping against hope that the Chinese government will pay some attention to their plight, or the international community will come to their rescue. But unfortunately, China knows that, China makes sure that there's no evidence of any of this kind. And the world does not listen only to pictures. They need credible evidence.
I wanted to ask another question, because as time continues to pass and the Tibetan community in exile becomes more assimilated into the places that they've lived, and many of them have never been to Tibet. I believe you
including
haven't been,
me.
Yeah, including you. Is there a concern that the identity, that the strength of the government in exile weakens? And what happens sort of over time as people either lose the connection to Tibet, or, there's continued repression, the Tibetan people would, in Tibet, or, continued on the path towards forced assimilation?
So there are some things that we are doing and we need to do, including strengthening the relationship between the Tibetan leadership and the general public, because His Holiness does not travel as much as he used to before. So our job is to keep the Tibetan flock together in these 27, 30 different countries. So that's why, as a political leader, during my time, I traveled to every settlement 2 times to meet with the population, to make sure that the Tibetan population is in tune with the central Tibetan administration. And one of the things that we also need to do is institutionalize our relationship with governments. Right now, wherever we travel, we receive little respect from governments and parliamentarians because of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So now, when His Holiness is alive, we have to institutionalize our relations with governments that will set a precedent for the governments to follow for another 15, 20 years down the line. If a new Sikyong, whenever Sikyong comes in, he also or she also should receive the same treatment from governments. So this is what we are trying to do. 2 things. One is to strengthen our institutions here, keep our relations with the public intact, even though we are physically becoming more distant, but to keep them emotionally close, which His Holiness has been doing over the years. Now it's upon us to do that. So now it's us who's going to shape the future. And we are doing everything possible to keep the Tibetan community together in many different ways.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about Tibetan democracy. I think we live in a world where in many places democracy is in retreat. And so I think it's quite fascinating that even without a homeland at the moment, the government in exile has committed to democracy. And I'm curious why that has been something that has been so important to the Tibetan government. And then I wanted to ask about these recent elections, because it seems complicated enough to have elections in one country, but across 27 countries, how does Tibetan democracy play out, for example, in these elections that you just had the first part of?
I think the seed of Tibetan democracy is the vision of His Holiness. His Holiness has always been a democrat. Even as early as 1952, when he was only about 17 years old, he introduced reforms in Tibet. And it could not be carried out because Chinese were already there in Tibet from 1951 onwards. So that didn't work, but His Holiness had a fair enough idea of what democracy meant. His Holiness visited China in 1954-55, met with Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, Zhao Dai, all those leaders of those times, and saw how communist government functioned. Everything looked very orderly, but people didn't have the freedom to speak their mind. And then just before His Holiness came back, Mao Zedong told him religion is poison. So then 56, 57, His Holiness was in India, just 10 years after India's independence, very nascent democracy, but quite chaotic. also, but His Holiness found that everybody had the freedom to speak their mind. So no sooner did we come into exile in 1959, March 31, by 3rd February 1960, not even 1 year after coming in, under very difficult circumstances, some 85,000 Tibetans proceeded to follow His Holiness. We were not used to the heat, not used to diet. Many Tibetans died. So we had to send them to the foothills of the Himalayas where the climatic conditions are a little more. So under those very difficult circumstances, His Holiness thought of having a representative government. And so since that time, those days, Tibetans never believed that we will have to live in exile for so long. Even the 13th Dalai Lama went on to exile after young husband expedition into Lhasa. The 13th Dalai Lama went to Mongolia, and then to China, and then came back. 3 months after that, the Chinese army were in the eastern sector. Then the 13th Dalai Lama had to flee into India for 2 years. So after 2 years, His Holiness returned back. So during the 14th Dalai Lama also, we all thought that we will go back pretty soon, not live here in exile for so long, but it has been now 66 years. But His Holiness has always been a visionary. From 1960 onwards, he has been promoting democracy, 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 even sometimes against the wishes of the Tibetan people. So I remember once coming here in 2000, when my predecessor was just elected, 2010-11, I was the Speaker of the House, and His Holiness held our hand. We meet with Speaker Biner, Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi at that time was leader, and then chair of some 4 or 5 committees. And His Holiness told us from morning, if there are political questions, you answer, pointing to my predecessor. If there are democratic questions on democracy, you answer. So one lady said, oh, all this devolution happened very smoothly in so short a time. And I was explaining, from your perspective, it did happen smoothly, but for us as Parliament and Speaker, we were stuck between the aspiration of the Tibetan people on the one hand, where they want His Holiness to continue with his responsibilities, and on the other hand, you have His Holiness, a very strong, determined His Holiness. Then His Holiness held my left hand and stopped me and said, sometimes very stubborn Dalai Lama. So that's how His Holiness, whenever he thought it's the right time, he introduced change. The first 30 years was difficult. We went through a lot of difficulties, overcome. Our people had no idea of what democracy meant, what organs, institutions do you need for democracy. So all this evolved over the first 30 years. Then His Holiness said we need more reforms, whether we need political parties or not, whether we need 2 chambers or not. So some 4 or 5 suggestions. We could not agree on any other thing other than increasing the number of members. So from 1991, the Parliament became a fully functional legislative body. Then 2001, 10 years after that, His Holiness, again, we need more changes. I'm not going to live forever. So we changed to, direct election of the current Triba. That was the first direct election. Then 10 years after that, His Holiness said, I'm going to completely devolve all my, I was the Speaker at that time. So this is the democratic evolution that we have seen over the last 66 years. And because of His Holiness' dogged pushing the Tibetan community towards democracy, unlike many other democracies where you have to, spend blood and sweat to get it, it's the other way around for the Tibetan community. We were reluctant to take power. His Holiness always keeps insisting. So I think His Holiness did all this purposely at different stages, looking at the compatibility of the people to be able to take up those as well. And today I can say pretty confidently that we have now democratic experience over the last 65 years, and people are also maturing to this. People are becoming more informed, all that. So we have, that's why we keep saying Tibetan government in exile is the only government in exile with a fully functional democratic polity. We have our Supreme Justice Commission, we have our Parliament, we have our Cabinet with 7 ministries or departments, and we have the 3 autonomous bodies of Election Commission, Public Service Commission, and Auditor General's Office. Right now, China is doing a lot of smear campaigns on corruption. We don't have enough money for corruption. We are corrupt free. We are corrupt-free. We have a very good accountability system, internal audit, and then finally having to go through Indian audit. And the Election Commission is responsible for holding this election every 5 years. And then aside from that, we have local assemblies, the local legislative bodies in all the Tibetan settlements. So Tibetan Freedom Movement, those elections are all conducted by free and fair by the Election Commission. So we go through 2 rounds, both for the parliament and the Sikyong's post. The first round is the preliminary round, which we voted day before yesterday on 1st of February. And the final round has to happen on April 26th. So the result will be out, official result will be out of the preliminary on 25th February, because it has to come from all over the world, and then Election Commission has to total it up and then, without mistake, announce it. So this is what we follow. First round, you can vote for anybody.
And is it electronic voting? How do you, from a practical perspective, how do you get people across 27 countries?
Right now, it's manual. In fact, we have been proposing and, all to have absentee ballot or postal ballot, or, can we do it online? But right now, all the important organizations have not been able to concur on this, but otherwise we are willing to. We are not lacking behind in using technology. We are using AI, we are using all kind of things in the Tibetan administration.
Great. Well, I want to get to some questions because I know we have some. So if folks in the room have any questions, we can go there first, and then we have some online questions as well. So if you have a question, can you raise your hand and make sure you actually ask a question, introduce yourself, those things. It looks like we have one in the back there and one in the front here. So we'll take both of them and then can answer them together.
Great to be here with you and at the Atlantic Council and hearing your wise words and hope for the Tibetan people. Recently, you were involved with a book launch last week with Dr. Hongxiang Lao. Tibet was never part of China since antiquity. Could you just tell us a little bit about that book and why it's important in the work that you're now doing?
Yeah. We'll take the question at the back.
Hi, Kimberly Reed, former chairman of the Export-Import Bank of the United States, and currently a distinguished fellow here at Atlantic Council Center for Freedom and Prosperity. Just like to hear your thoughts when it comes to U.S. goods and services and things that can possibly happen on the trade front. I know it's very, very complicated right now, but just any economic thoughts and reflections you might have that you'd like for the Trump administration to appreciate.
Thank you. Professor Lau's book is a very important tool for us. As I mentioned, our official policy is middle way policy. But we have to gain recognition for the ends, which is one is the historical status of Tibet as an independent state. And this book coming from a Chinese, that makes it more valuable. And also his evidence is all irrefutable. The Chinese, he published his Chinese version in 2019. Then we translated it into Tibetan a few years ago by a Tibetan who voluntarily did it on his own. And the English translation took some time because his professor is very, very particular. He says, I'm challenging the Chinese government, so I don't want one single mistake in my book, even a comma. So when you rearrange the book, then appendix and all goes wrong, so you have to manually do that. So that took a lot of time, and I think professor is also going to work on another book. So the Chinese narrative that Tibet has been part of China since antiquity has fallen flat. China has not been able to refute what Professor Lau had been doing. And Lau was mentioning at Jamestown when we met there, he was mentioning that I'm sure any Chinese who have done study on Tibet would have found that Tibet is not part of China. But they are not willing to talk about it because they have to work under the government of China. And Professor has done this at personal risk hopefully nothing will happen. But then he had the courage, as a Chinese, he had the courage to speak the truth, which we have not been able to do, the research, kind of research that professors did, because you have to understand traditional Chinese to be able to, the books and all are there. So I asked the professor, now that you have used all these documents, do you think Chinese government withdraw all these documents? He said, no, it's not possible, because it's part of Chinese history. So he's taking all these elements of Tibetan independence, not being part of China, from the Chinese history, which they cannot take off the websites or online. So you can still have it in Hong Kong or Beijing libraries. So those are very much there. So you cannot refute that. That's why it's very important. And I keep carrying Lao's book with me when I visit every foreign ministry or politician when I meet them. And Lao's book, we started distributing from yesterday to all the members of Congress that we meet, that the ones who are going to meet tomorrow, a lineup of them tomorrow. So yeah, this is the narrative that we have to spread. It's very important for us to, so that will put our cause in the path forward. Then the US, China, I'm not an expert on business and all that, but I think right now the common refrain is that US has to get out of the stranglehold of China's rare earth supplies. So once you do that, then you might have more leverage with China, but that will take some time. It's not easy to get a supply of rare earth back on track in such a short time. But that's the leverage that China is using. China has been using all the kind of leverage that America is using today. So it's pointing fingers at each other. But I have always been saying that we should give less business to China. Because this year also China managed to meet its GDP expectations because of exports. And export has increased by about 25%. Last year, China had a surplus of about 876 or 92 billion. And this year it has gone to $1.2 trillion of foreign exchange. So once they have all this money, then they splurge it on space technology, on dual-use technology, on military, and all the things that the free world doesn't want. So I keep saying, one of our German friends said, he was asking me about China, the dragon is biting at us and all. I said, see, the dragon at one time was very weak. But it was United States, Europe, Japan, Taiwan, all of them combined together to make China for what it is today. And now knowing that the dragon is biting at you, if you still keep feeding the dragon, then I tell them, whose fault is it? And there has to be, especially from a European perspective, I keep telling them, just like Prime Minister Carney had said about the middle powers at Davos conference, that the Europeans need to come together. If you don't come together, have a common trade policy or a foreign policy, then China is going to pick one nation after another, just like the colonials used to do against the colonies of divide and rule and carrot and stick. Same thing China is doing against the Europeans today. So they have to learn from all this and have a common front. When Norway conferred Liu Xiaobo with the Nobel Peace Prize, China was doubling down on Norway. But if you take Norway with China, Norway is a very small country. If all Europeans don't come together, China is going to gobble you up. So that's what is happening. And when I was in Mexico also, some people tell me, why you are going to Latin America? You won't have government support. But I said, we need to educate people. We don't go to Mexico just to explain about Tibet, but we are also concerned about Mexican people or the Canadian people. Because, of course, you recalibrate relations, but then again, where it's going to lead to. Is China going to force you to buy more? Because China is now promoting free trade everywhere, because that's what they want. They have surplus of products, right? And you have already seen about 20% increase of imports in all the Southeast Asian countries from China over the last few months. In Europe, about 8 to 10%. In the African countries, more than 20% increase of Chinese imports. And the Chinese now secondary market for Chinese EVs are becoming Brazil and Thailand. So China is diversifying, but then again, the question is how much purchasing power does the global South have, unlike the Europeans or the Americans? So there are a lot of things that we need to keep in mind, but even in Mexico, I told them, we were taken on a small street with toys on all sides, and when I looked through the window, there's all Chinese boxes. So I told the Mexican, your toy industry is gone now. And some were saying, oh, the Chinese products are cheap. I said, yes, it is cheap, it benefits the consumers now, but over the long run, if you keep buying more and more Chinese products, cheap products, all your small-scale industries and mid-sized industries will collapse. Then your people will become jobless. Then you won't even have enough salary to buy cheap Chinese products in the long run.
We have a couple questions that came in online, sort of also asking about politics. So I'm going to put two of these questions to you at once because we are running short on time.
Sure.
But we have one question that you'll see here as well from Marjorie Mandelstam-Balzer, who asks, has the position of His Holiness the Dalai Lama changed regarding talks with China since President Trump came to power and has sort of destabilized international relations? And I'll also put another question to you from Carolyn Costello, who says that Trump will visit President Xi in Beijing this April. If you could add one Tibet-related deliverable to the list of items that Trump will discuss during that meeting, what would it be?
That would be to take Tibetans seriously and negotiate with them. And that's also part of the 2002 Tibet Policy Act for the US government to report on negotiations and also encourage negotiations. So that is the most important thing. To resolve the Sino-Tibet conflict, there has to be negotiations, otherwise it's not going to lead anywhere. So what I have been telling my people is that we have to realize two facts. One is that if there has to be a solution for Sino-Tibet conflict peacefully through the middle way, then it can come only from China. It cannot come from anywhere else, not from the United States, not from NATO, not from India. Nobody is going to fight for Tibet. Fight a war with China on Tibet. And the second is, till such a time, we'll have to reach out to the international community. But then when we reach out to the international community, we have to put forth our position in such a way that it meets the national interests of that country also, while addressing our national interests, the interests of the Tibetan people. So these things we keep in mind, because then we have realistic expectation of what we can get from the international community. So right now, as many countries say that Tibet was historically an independent state, even while we are asking for middle way, that could open a lot of windows after depending on what scenarios China will go through in future. Political implosion, external, so many things. And the first question on His Holiness, whether His Holiness' position has changed since Trump came into power, it has not. Now, His Holiness does not interfere much in the political. We are responsible for doing that. When it comes to dealing with China, right now, I'm responsible. I'm taking the lead. But when a stage comes that there could be real negotiations, then it'll be His Holiness who will appoint his envoys or special envoys. That's how it's structured right now. So His Holiness believes in the middle way, even now, that he believes in the interests of everybody, not just benefit for the Tibetans.
So I think in closing, I just want to ask you what role you think international actors can play. So you talked about just now a sort of this recognition of the sort of historical accuracy of Tibet being independent, but what do you want to see? What are you asking? You said you're meeting with a bunch of members of Congress. What are you asking for? What does the Tibetan administration need from the international community? What type of support?
It depends on government to government. Government to a little rich, then we extend both our arms, one for political support and one for financial programmatic support. Governments that don't have much fund, then we ask only for political support. So when we say political support, we have a policy right now. Based on that, we cannot ask governments to jump ahead of us, or so we have to strategically move one step at a time and see how we can take it forward, just like we have been doing over the last 3-4 years. So again, we need to increase our visibility. We need to increase our outreach, because the more I come here, the members that I keep meeting now, we are on first name terms, So that's how you build relations. That's how you build networks. So we will have to reach out to the international community more than ever before, explain about the issues. So the two issues we talked about, the reincarnation of His Holiness, where we need support from the free world as to what Tibetans are thinking. And then on the political front, to at least acknowledge the truth, historical truth that Tibet was an independent state. So where it will lead to in future is something that we'll watch as time goes and how the international political scenario evolves, unfolds, and how situation in China unfolds. Because there are a lot of vulnerabilities, because when I travel to South America, they say, China is a strong, monolithic. I said, yes, it is strong, monolithic from the outside, but there are a lot of vulnerabilities as well. You saw about Sangyusha and all that. So if we go into that, again, it'll be another topic to discuss. But yeah, there are a lot of vulnerabilities that we'll have to look out for. That's why we are looking at different scenarios.
Great. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. But Sikyong, I wanted to thank you so much for being here and being with us and sharing all of your insights.
Thank you, Adva. Welcome.
Lanzo